This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 942 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. Before I get to the transactions this week, I want to remind you to check out Underdog. Over on Underdog, you can play Pick'em and Champions mode, and of course, you can do snake drafts every single week. Just looking at the lobby, there are literally over 20 drafts you can join right now for this week's slate. To check it all out, head to UnderdogFantasy.com and sign up with promo code LATEROUND. That'll get you a deposit offer, and it'll also get you a link to my rest of season rankings. That's if you sign up with promo code LATEROUND, make a deposit, and start playing. Now let's get to these transactions. Add Audric Estime. The Broncos in total, their running backs have not been very effective on the ground this year. You can look at their team rushing EPA, and it ranks just below average compared to the rest of the league. But don't forget, they have a mobile quarterback. Javonte Williams and Jaleel McLaughlin have been below average in rushing yards over expected per rush, and neither of them are giving us that much in terms of EPA. So I don't think it's that surprising to see how the Broncos deployed Audric Estime in Week 10. Against the Chiefs, he played 45% of the team's offensive snaps. His previous high in snap share was 10%. He had a running back rush share of about 82%. That was actually a season high for the entire team, for any running back all year. It was clear that the Broncos just wanted to get Estime more involved. Now, Estime as a prospect, if you didn't listen to me during the offseason, he profiled as an early down bruiser. The Zap model didn't love him, though, because he wasn't that much of a pass catcher. He was on the younger side, though. He's a younger prospect. Now, we should anticipate Denver using him in that way. We even saw that in Week 10. Despite seeing the snap share, despite seeing the running back rush share, he still trailed Javonte Williams in routes run. But when usage trends up like this for a rookie running back, you have to try to get him off the waiver wire. I do have to say, though, Denver's running back schedule rest of season, it's kind of rough when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. Buy Deebo Samuel. So we don't have a huge sample size of Deebo Samuel without Brandon Ayuk in this Brock Purdy era. But we do have something. In Ayuk's single missed game last year, Samuel saw a 35% target share and he scored 25 PPR points. Prior to Week 10 and since the start of 2023, this is according to Adam Levitan over at Establish the Run, Samuel had a 30% target share and a 48% targets per out run rate on plays where Ayuk was off the field. Now, Samuel didn't hit those marks against the Buccaneers on Sunday. Instead, he only had an 18% target share and a 17% targets per out run rate. But I don't think that one game tells us the entire story. Look at his historical splits. Look at what his numbers have been even when Ayuk has been healthy. So I'd be willing to trade for Deebo Samuel this week. The ceiling is still pretty massive, and San Francisco doesn't have the worst fantasy playoff schedule. In the playoffs, they get the Rams, Dolphins, and Lions. So I do think that Samuel's a buy. Add Ricky Pearsall. Now, at the very least, if you don't want to trade for Samuel, you can just add Ricky Pearsall off the waiver wire if he's out there. Now, I talked about Pearsall in last week's Sleepers episode, and he came through with 17 PPR points. He saw just as many targets as Deebo Samuel did. He ran a route on 71% of San Francisco's dropbacks. That's not great, but it's really solid. Now, last week, I talked about Jawan Jennings as a buy. I would still rather have Jennings than Pearsall rest of season. His usage was better, and he's been balling out this year. But Pearsall should have plenty of usability in this high-powered offense. I highly doubt he's going to be sleeper eligible here in Week 11. Sell Mark Andrews. It's been a wild year for Mark Andrews. As you guys know, he got off to a really slow start. Through his first 4 games, he totaled 12.5 PPR points combined. And then as a result, on this show, I said in shallower formats, Mark Andrews was a drop candidate. And then naturally, right after that, he kind of goes on a heater. He's averaged 13.9 PPR points per game over his last 6. And in Week 10, he scored 18.8 PPR points. He had a season high 22% target share. He's been a tight end 1 ever since everyone gave up on him. Now, production is always what we want. We need our fantasy assets to score points. But we can't just ignore how they're scoring points. Andrews has been running hot, but he's been running hot mostly through finding the end zone. He scored 5 touchdowns over his last 5 games. That's not going to be easy to sustain. And he's done that while only getting to a 20% target share one time. And that one time was last week. And last week, Isaiah Likely was sidelined. Now, if Isaiah Likely continues to miss games, then Mark Andrews does have a shot to produce. In week 10, he ran a route on 94% of Baltimore's dropbacks. That was by far a season high. His route participation this year has been between 50% and 70% most weeks. He was at 94% without Isaiah Likely. We were seeing old Mark Andrews. So with this recommendation, I think that you could just wait to hear about Isaiah Likely, because that is a very big deal. But if we do see that Likely's back, I'm anticipating Mark Andrews' usage to go back to what we've seen all season long. And his production has sort of outpaced that usage since week 4. So right now, if you're sitting here and you can get something from Mark Andrews that's equal to where he was drafted in your fantasy drafts this year, I don't think that's a bad idea at all. Especially as you look at the fantasy playoffs, Ravens tight ends have the 3rd toughest schedule in the league according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. Now look, I don't think you absolutely have to do this transaction, but I do think there's a very real chance, as long as Isaiah Likely ends up being healthy, that this is a high point for Mark Andrews from a usage perspective. Add Adonai Mitchell. So Michael Pittman missed week 10 because of a back injury that's been lingering and also a finger injury. That allowed rookie Adonai Mitchell to step in as more of a full-time player in this Colts offense. And he ended up seeing a 17% target share. That was his highest mark since week 1. He also saw a season-high 95% route participation. Now, the Colts have a pretty average rest of season schedule for wide receivers. And things could change very quickly if Michael Pittman returns. Or if Indianapolis ends up giving Anthony Richardson that starting job again. It does sound like Joe Flacco is going to start this week, though. But Mitchell has some upside as a high-variance talent. If you guys listen to my prospecting work over the offseason, then you know that my model didn't love A.D. Mitchell. But it was very obvious that his profile just had a lot of volatility. So maybe that high end ends up hitting. And I am adding Mitchell over Alec Pierce for this single reason. We kind of know what we're getting out of Alec Pierce. We know that he hasn't been a reliable starter in fantasy football. So I would just rather take a shot on A.D. Mitchell and see if something really comes of it. Because the Colts could also just start giving him more run. Buy Jacoby Myers. Fantasy managers don't want to invest in the Raiders offense, and I can't blame them. But that could create some buying opportunities. I think Jacoby Myers is a good football player. And without Devontae Adams, he's been seeing some really good usage in this offense. Adams last played for the Raiders back in week 3 against the Panthers. Through that point in time, the first 3 weeks of the season, Myers was averaging just a 15% target share per game rate. Since then, that number shot up to almost 32%, which is really, really good. Now, the Raiders have a tough short-term schedule for wide receivers, but it gets good in the fantasy playoffs. They get the Falcons, the Jags, and the Saints. Those are all top half matchups by adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, and Atlanta and Jacksonville are top 7 matchups. Now, you could wait to trade for Myers, but I would rather just trade for him right now, because people might start to see this usage trend. But there is a chance, given the harder immediate schedule, that there may be another buy moment before your trade deadline. Add Gus Edwards. So Gus Edwards returned from IR in week 10. He pushed Kamani Vidal to inactive status. And Edwards got right back to work. He had a running back rush share of 37%. Now, as usual, Edwards didn't see a target. That's going to be a problem for him in fantasy football. He only ran 2 routes on Sunday. Before his injury, he was in that 10 to 30% route participation range. That's not going to really cut it from a ceiling perspective. J.K. Dobbins is still playing that role. But as a bye week fill-in, as someone to play when the Chargers might see a positive game script, that's where Gus Edwards could be useful. Buy Justin Herbert. So if you listen to last week's mailbag episode, you're already a step ahead, because someone asked me about Justin Herbert and how I felt about him rest of season. And my answer was that he was kind of a buy candidate. This is just a more formal way of saying that. I'm just not sure the fantasy football market really realizes what's happening with Justin Herbert. And it's probably because of an anchoring bias. Because to start the season, he wasn't very good in fantasy. He averaged 11.7 standard fantasy points per game across his first 6 games. But we have to remember he was dealing with that ankle injury. We have seen some signs that he's recovered. Not only has he averaged over 21 points per game over his last 3, but he's also seen a rushing yards per game average of about 28 yards during the stretch. Across his first 6 games when he wasn't performing very well, he was averaging 5.7 rushing yards per game. The Chargers also aren't as run heavy. According to Fantasy Life data, LA's dropbacks over expected rate has been positive, meaning they've been more pass heavy than expected in 3 of their last 4 games. They weren't in the green during any of their first 5 games this season. So the Chargers are throwing it a little bit more. Justin Herbert is running it a little bit more. And guess what? Their rest of season schedule, it's 4th best for quarterbacks when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. It's 3rd best over the next 4 weeks. They have upcoming matchups against the Bengals, Ravens, and Falcons. Now, there's rarely a need to go really crazy for a quarterback in a single quarterback league. But I do think that Herbert makes sense as a buy. Add Will Dissly. So we'll talk about another Charger and we'll talk about Will Dissly. So Hayden Hurst missed weeks 7 and 8. Will Dissly saw a spike in usage during that time. From weeks 1 through 6, Dissly averaged a 12.7% target share per game rate. His route participation was usually in that 30%, 40% range. That's what he was seeing through the first month and a half of the season. But without Hayden Hurst for those 2 weeks, his target share jumped to 26.5%. His route participation was in the 75% range. Now, the reason I didn't talk about adding him then was because Hayden Hurst was returning, which he did 2 weeks ago. I figured that we'd see Dissly's usage drop again, but that has not happened. He's now coming off 2 games with Hurst, and he saw target shares of 12% and 33% in those 2 games. Most importantly, his route share has been around 68%. It's looking like Will Dissly is officially the primary pass-catching tight end for this Chargers offense. And like I just said with Justin Herbert, they have a pretty favorable rest of season schedule. So I think Will Dissly is an obvious add. Add Kayshon Boutte. I feel like not enough people are talking about Kayshon Boutte right now, which, by the way, it is Boutte, it's not Boutte. That's out of his mouth. Boutte has seen his usage just get better and better in this New England offense. Earlier this year, his route participation was sort of in that 30% to 60% range. In week 6, that rose to 76%. Then in his next game, it was 88%. This past week in week 10, it was 100%. He ran a route on every single New England dropback. And good target shares have followed this uptick in route participation, which is what we generally see. He's now hit the 20% target share mark in 2 of his last 3 games. Now, some of you might remember the Zap model did like Kayshon Boutte coming out. He just seemed to have some work ethic issues. But if that's changed, if he's figured that out, we're looking at a very talented player with an up-and-coming quarterback. Maybe things won't hit this year, but I think that he absolutely needs to be on your radar. Add Marquez Valdes-Scantling. Now look, the good here is that Marquez Valdes-Scantling scored 25.9 PPR points on Sunday, and he's on a team that lacks wide receiver depth and talent. New Orleans' top receivers in routes run against Atlanta were Marquez Valdes-Scantling, Mason Tipton, and Kevin Austin Jr. Now, the bad side of this is that this is MVS. We have a pretty big sample size of him not being this high-end fantasy contributor. And despite leading the team in routes run this past week at wide receiver, there was still a pretty heavy rotation. He ran a route on just 2/3 of the team's dropbacks. He only had a 14% target share. So yes, I think that you can add MVS coming off this big performance. What if it leads to more work? What if they do give him a better route share? Just don't go crazy. Sell DeAndre Swift. Now, a couple of weeks ago on a 10 Trends episode, I talked about DeAndre Swift and the schedule that he was about to face. Over Swift's last 5 games, he's faced 3 top 10 favorable opponents for running backs by adjusted fantasy points allowed. Ever since he kind of turned things around after week 3, The Bears have faced an opponent who's ranked on average as roughly the 10th best matchup for running backs. Their schedule has been pretty good of late. Now, the hope was that Swift could come through in a good matchup against the Patriots, but he didn't. The whole offense didn't. He only scored 7.5 PPR points. That was his lowest output since week 3. So yeah, you're kind of selling low here. There's no doubt. And I'll be honest, his peripherals, they still don't look that bad. He actually handled 94% of the team's running back rushes in week 10. The reason I have him as a sell is because their upcoming schedule, it's scary. 4 of their next 6 games are against the Vikings and Lions. Minnesota's the 3rd toughest matchup for running backs right now in adjusted fantasy points allowed. Detroit's the 5th toughest one. Did you see what Joe Mixon did on the ground against the Lions on Sunday night? If DeAndre Swift doesn't see work through the air, he could be doomed. In the end, Bears running backs have the toughest remaining schedule in the league right now. And in the fantasy playoffs, they do have 1 game against the Vikings and 1 game against the Lions. Even if a change does come offensively, this schedule is just not appealing enough for me. This isn't doing it for me. You may be able to sell him this week before those Minnesota and Detroit matchups start to hit. Add Cam Akers. Speaking of Minnesota, Aaron Jones is a little bit banged up with a ribs injury, but thankfully it doesn't sound like he's going to miss this weekend's game, but there's always a chance. We never know when we're talking early in the week. So it can't hurt to try to add Cam Akers off the waiver wire. He's been operating as the clear-cut RB2 in Minnesota over the last couple of weeks. He's had snap shares of 23% and 29%. So if Jones misses any time, I would anticipate Cam Akers being the 1A in that backfield, and then Ty Chandler would be the 1B. Add Russell Wilson. So look, there's no doubt in my mind that Russell Wilson is beating math a little bit right now. He has a 7.1% touchdown rate. That's not very sustainable. But he gets Baltimore this week. Now, you may be a little bit scared that this game isn't super high scoring because, after all, it's the Steelers and Ravens. But Baltimore's secondary has been such a good target for fantasy purposes. On the year, only 2 teams have allowed more adjusted fantasy points to quarterbacks than the Ravens have. Quarterbacks facing Baltimore have seen a boost in well over 70 passing yards versus their season-long averages. That's by far the highest adjusted passing yards allowed mark in the league. So Wilson, who's rostered in just 22% of Yahoo leagues, he's a good streamer. Add the Green Bay Packers defense. So if the Texans are available on your waiver wire, they get Dallas. I think that they're an obvious add. You could even look at the Saints and the Dolphins too. But the Packers are out there in a lot of leagues because they were on a bye this week. And they're 6.5 point favorites against the Bears. Chicago, as we know, they're struggling offensively. They've allowed 15 sacks over their last 2 games. Now, Green Bay, they're below average at getting to the quarterback, at least in terms of pressure rate. But if you look at Chicago's last 2 opponents, it's been Arizona and New England. Their pressure rates are actually worse than Green Bay's. Things can change in Chicago, but on paper, this is a really good spot for the Packers defense. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you had subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter, @LateRoundQB. I'm also on Blue Sky now, which is also @LateRoundQB, so check that out. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly 10 Trends episode.